Welcome. I'm Scott Kennedy. I'm a Deputy Director of the Freeman Chair in China Studies here at CSIS and also Director of our project on Chinese business and political economy. And I want to welcome you to our event on China's rapid drive into new generation vehicles. It's going to be an excellent discussion, combination of me presenting a report and then we have an excellent panel. I look forward also to everyone's participation as well. We're delighted to participate, to have this China Innovation Policy Series in partnership with our technology policy program here at CSIS. And we really appreciate the partnership that we have with our corporate sponsors, Microsoft, the General Electric Foundation, the Semiconductor Industry Association, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and JETRO. I am, besides an expert on China's economy, I'm also a fire marshal today. I'm here to protect you all. So if there is any incident or any problems or anything like that, we've got exits behind you, exits behind me. We will meet across the street. That's not going to happen. I can guarantee it, but we take your safety very seriously. Let me make sure this is working. All right. As I said, this is part of our China Innovation Policy Series, which we're doing over 2 years. We've already issued 2 reports, the Fat Tech Dragon last August, which looked at innovation trends in China in comparative perspective and put the Chinese in global context. We had a report by my colleague Sam Sachs in January on China and the digital economy. Today's discussion about new generation vehicles will be integrated into our report on that topic, which should come out next month. And then we'll have additional reports on commercial aircraft, on artificial intelligence, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals in China. So this is part of a larger effort to to measure exactly where the Chinese are in their innovation drive, not just what their policies are, but actual performance. We have a great panel that we'll turn to in a little while. I'll introduce them after the report. One of the members of the panel is under the weather this morning, so is likely not going to make it. But we have 3 other fantastic panelists who are going to share their expertise on different aspects of this question. So let me tell you my view about China's efforts in new generation vehicles. This is not one of them. This is a car from the 1950s, and China in the Mao era developed most of its initial passenger vehicles following Soviet models. And this was one that you could have driven around, not if you were a regular person, if you were a very senior official, you might have. I first went to China 30 years ago. In late January of 1988, so exactly 30 years ago. I took some of my pictures. This was a typical street in Beijing, not what it looks like today, all right? No private cars. This is what transportation looked like for most people back then. If someone told you they had a private car, they were lying. What they did is they bought their work unit had a car and let them use it. Again, very different situation from the way it is today in China. Now, to address the challenges of China's poor performance cars, the lack of personal car options, the Chinese initial strategy in the late 80s and 90s was to form joint ventures with the world's leading car manufacturers. The first in 1983 was with AMC Jeep. But then along came, in 1985, VW's joint venture with SAIC in Shanghai, which is still the largest, most successful one in China. It's huge for VW, and this system of forming joint ventures where the Chinese thought that they could, through these partnerships, get technology transfer, management expertise, manufacturing abilities, and build their own domestic, successful, independently powerful producers. Well, that's only partially worked out. China has had some independent producers emerge. Geely was the first private Chinese car company that started producing in 1999. And there have been several others, including BYD and Great Wall and others. But these folks, if you look at the market share statistics for China, you'll see those that are in red, they still dominate market share in China for passenger vehicles. There are a few like Geely that have moved up, but overall, China's passenger car market is still dominated by foreign brands. And so this is a challenge. So even though you've had improvements in parts of the sector, supply in that supply chain that's part of it, and some significant improvements, it's still a sector in which Western brands dominate. China has another problem. In addition to this, you may have heard China has an air pollution problem, right? It's gotten a little bit better in some cities, but overall, China's air quality is still horrendous. And it has generated a significant domestic political backlash in China. Every Chinese person on their phone has an app which will tell them what the air quality is in their city. And everybody knows that a part of the problem is internal combustion engines from cars. And this is a huge challenge to address. China has another big problem. China is a huge importer of oil. It's now the world's largest importer of oil, and it's growing. And China's relationship with the Middle East is evolving to be like the United States' relationship with the Middle East in terms of energy dependence. And so this is a big challenge for China, the world's largest importer of oil, and the forecasts are for China to continue to increase the amount of oil that it needs to import, as well as other fossil fuels. As a result of these three challenges, China's got significant motivation to develop new energy vehicles. For industrial policy, they want to break the monopoly that Western manufacturers have in China and elsewhere. They want to deal with their air pollution problem. And they want to deal with their energy security problem and the dependence on foreign oil imports. The solution for that, one of the solutions, not the only solution, are electric vehicles. New energy vehicles, not just pure electrics, but hybrids. There's been a debate in China, and most of the attention now in China is on pure electrics with some support for hybrids. But in any case, moving away from internal combustion engines in automobiles is a key solution, and the Chinese have made this a high area of emphasis. The policies to support new energy vehicles basically come out in two phases. The first early phase involved R&D support and financing, initial subsidies that went to buyers, and those subsidies then were shifted to go to the producers. From the buyer's perspective, it's still a lower priced vehicle for you, but the money actually goes to the producers. And then emission standards. China developed relatively high emission standards and has gradually raised those over time. Since 2015, China has come out with an additional wave of policies which are highly focused and targeted, and they keep getting stronger and stronger over time. In addition to those first wave of policies, increased R&D support and funding, increased subsidies for electric, especially pure electric vehicles, increased emission standards. The Chinese have also instituted a requirement that for foreign companies that want to manufacture in China electric cars, you must have a joint venture. You can't be a wholly foreign-owned subsidiary in China. You must have a joint venture, and you must that produces an electric vehicle, and it must have a local brand. In addition, one of the most interesting innovations policy-wise, China modeled on policies in California, was this dual credit system, is that all auto manufacturers in China, beginning this year, will receive points for the types of cars they produce, and they have to have, what the consequence of this policy is that car companies will have to have a certain proportion of their fleets in China that are electric, either hybrids or pure electric. And if you don't meet the standard that's required, you'll have to buy credits from others. This is what's called a dual credit system. This year, it is essentially voluntary. By next year, by 2019, this will have real teeth in it. And it will require car companies to have somewhere between 5 to 10% of their fleets as pure electric or hybrids. And the exact numbers are subject to change, but this is a huge, genuine constraint on producing in China. In addition, there are license plate restrictions, so if you're a person, you want to go buy a vehicle, you have to get a license plate. And license plates aren't just handed out to you. You have to have the government give you a license plate for your car, and they prioritize license plates for those that buy electric. In addition, China has provided lots of policy support for the development of batteries and all of the components of batteries and the materials that go into batteries. And China now has lots of battery makers. In addition, China's put a lot of investment and funding into charging infrastructure, public infrastructure in cities, along all of China's highways. They've also mandated that new apartment buildings come with charging facilities and piles inside if there's parking inside the building. And so they're looking at the entire supply chain and all of the infrastructure related to new energy vehicles. In addition, some people think that China has said that by a date certain they want to go all electric. That's actually wrong. Reuters and Caixin, a Chinese media organization, reported on a meeting that was held in September last year in Beijing, in Tianjin, where a mid-level Chinese official mentioned this idea that China is considering this. The reason he said that was because just the week before, Great Britain and France had set their targets, and he didn't want to be caught looking backward. But he also was happy to put out a trial balloon and give the impression that China was going all electric as a mandate, even though he didn't specifically state that. China's Minister of Science and Technology recently has given a speech where he didn't mention this, and no other Chinese official has publicly mentioned this since then. But the impression of all of these policies, including that hint, is to get everyone to pay attention to China and feel like it's going all electric and you can't miss the boat. So what's the consequence of this? China's the world's largest car market. It's been the world's largest car market. This is total vehicle sales back over the last decade. You'll see that for passenger vehicles, the difference is even more stark. And China is way ahead. Almost 25 million passenger vehicles sold last year. And a growing proportion of those are electric or new energy. This is the data. I'm sorry, the top is a little bit cut off. Hopefully you can see. But China last year sold at least 620,000 new energy vehicles, far more than anybody else, and now is now over 50% of global market share, if not more. In addition to overall production, China has not just a few makers of new energy vehicles, it has dozens of producers of new energy vehicles, and it has hundreds of wannabes, of companies that have formed, that have developed models, that take them to auto shows, that show them off. Here are this is a small sampling of companies that either make new energy vehicles or who plan to. That are in China. You may be surprised that one you've never heard of, Zhidou, actually sells the largest number of these in 2017, had the largest market share. So these very small, compact electric vehicles in China. We'll come back to some of these in a little while. In addition to these domestic makers, foreign companies have been rushing to form joint ventures. So I showed you an original list of joint ventures to produce internal combustion engines. What you'll see here are the joint ventures that exist now that either already are producing electric vehicles or plan to. So there are already 12 joint ventures in China, at least, that produce electric vehicles, and 13 in the pipeline that will as well. So that's a lot. I don't know about you, that's a big number. 25 of these joint ventures, in addition to the dozens of domestic Chinese companies that are already producing or plan to produce soon. In addition, there's been a rollout of the infrastructure for charging. You can go to EV charging stations for buses like the ones that BYD has built, or you can go to others that accompany gas stations, or like on the right, outside your apartment building, or along the highways, you can find these. So all over the country, China has now somewhere at around 200,000 public and private charging stations for electric vehicles. In addition, there's been a huge growth with battery makers and component suppliers of battery makers in China. These are just a few of them. The most successful recently, everyone knows about BYD and its batteries, which though mostly go to BYD vehicles. CATL, which is a company many in the West is not heard of, in Ningde in Fujian province, sells the most on the open market to other producers of new energy vehicles, and is also exporting now. As well, but there are dozens of Chinese battery producers. So that's all the positive and success with this sector, but there are some serious real challenges with where China is going in new energy vehicles that I think deserves pointing out. The first is the extent to which this is a market or not. So we went and we tried to calculate how much the Chinese government has spent on this sector. And it's not easy. The Chinese government reports data of about 120 billion. But we went and we recalculated the numbers for subsidies based on what they say they give for subsidies and for the type of cars they've sold each year. We went all the way back to 2009 and included data for 2017. And we came up with a much larger number, almost basically twice what they had estimated in public reports. We then calculated what the Chinese have probably spent on infrastructure subsidies, funding for research and development that car companies and others can apply for, and also vehicle procurement. So government agencies, public institutions also buy electric vehicles, and then actually they're mandated to do so. And so we went and totaled that up, and it gets to a pretty big number, at least for me. I don't know about you all, but $320-some billion in total government spending at least since 2009. We went and then calculated what the likely total sales of new energy vehicles has been since 2009, and then did the division, and it means that total government spending is about 35% of the total market, total revenue for this sector over the last 9 years. Now, a lot of times people who look at China and worry about whether or not it's a market economy will say, oh, subsidies account for somewhere between 30 to 40% of a sector's profits. This isn't 30 to 40% of a sector's profits. This is 30 to 40% of total sales. That's a lot more. Because in fact, in this sector, although there are some individual companies that are profitable, as a whole, the electric vehicle industry in China is not profitable. In fact, it's not profitable anywhere on the planet yet. It may be, but it's not profitable yet, at least for for the final car makers. Maybe for some of the component makers and stuff it is, but for the car makers, it's not been profitable. So this is a sector that is government created and wouldn't exist. Now, that's not necessarily saying a bad thing. It may be in the public interest for this to occur, but nevertheless, the amount of government support to create this industry is immense. So I showed you those logos of those Chinese companies that have now produced or coming out with electric vehicles as something that's impressive. I showed you the list of the 25 joint ventures. As impressive as it is, it also could be a big problem. You could have massive overcapacity if everyone just starts producing, in part because they can get these subsidies. And so there's a danger that China's new energy vehicle sector is going to go the route of China's solar sector, where there was massive overproduction and then exported, and the world then faced the challenges of dealing with China's overcapacity in solar. So we could potentially face the same challenge. If you talk to Chinese consumers, and I think the same if you talk to American consumers, the vast majority of Chinese still see buying an electric vehicle as a choice of principle, as a normative choice, as something that they would do to help the environment, as a sacrifice they would make to help the environment, not as buying a car that is cool, that they would just sort of apples to apples compare an electric car with some other car and not pay attention to the energy source. And so you actually in China, although they are the world's leading market for electric vehicles, only 1/3 of those sales are to private buyers. 2/3 are to public buyers. So this is a real challenge of whether or not China has a sustainable market for all of these producers coming online. In addition, you have a charging infrastructure challenge. The vast majority of charging infrastructure is in 3 cities in China, in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, which is in Guangdong province. And this infrastructure has been rolled out, and it's massive and pales anything by comparison. But if China wants to get to its targets of 7 to 10% of all vehicles being new energy vehicles by 2025, they're going to have to roll out 15 times this amount of charging in that period. That's a lot. Now, China is able to potentially do that, but it's not going to be able to be done just by government spending. It's going to require private investors as well, and those private investors are going to want to see a return on their investments. So that's a challenge. I'm not saying it's not overcomable, but it's a genuine big challenge. Another big challenge with the batteries. Batteries don't grow on trees, even if you'd like them to. They require components, not just lithium, and you think of lithium batteries, but they also have most of these batteries have actually more nickel than lithium, and they also have lots of cobalt. And most of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. Not a great place to do business. And the price of cobalt has been rising dramatically, in part because of China's drive into new energy vehicles. And the Chinese have invested massively in the DRC. And so we have a potential problem of the prices of the inputs into these batteries rocketing up, of there being dominant ownership of some of these resources. And so you just need to think back to 2010 and to the scare that occurred around what are called rare earths. And was China's provider of 95% of raw rare earths. We ended up getting over that because there are lots of substitutes to rare earths. But this is a real, again, I'm not giving you an answer, but I'm raising a challenge. If batteries have to come from someplace. In addition, you have potential challenges with market access in China. China has a 25% tariff on imported vehicles, which is why so many go to produce in China. But in addition to that, China has obstacles for foreign battery makers because they're trying to promote their domestic industry. China created a list of certified battery makers where if you sold your car with them, then you could get the subsidy. And that list didn't have any foreign makers. the world's three most successful, most advanced battery makers are Panasonic, Samsung, and LG. They've not had good business in China. And in 2017, Samsung and LG sold all of 0 batteries in China. You may have heard of this thing called THAAD, that the US and South Korea have been cooperating on, missile defense against North Korea. Well, as a result of that, the Chinese have been punishing South Korean companies, including Samsung and LG. So 0 batteries. So it aligns with both industrial policy goals and with security policy. Now, recently, South Korea and China look like they have started to improve the relationship a little bit, but so far, they haven't been able to start selling their batteries again in China. So this is a significant problem for China diplomatically, in addition to potentially technologically. Next issue, pollution. Electric vehicles are supposed to solve the air pollution problem. Well, to some extent that can be, but a big part of the equation is where does the energy come from that charges the batteries? So 60% of Chinese energy comes from coal, like these plants. Now, that is less than what it used to be several years ago when it was 70%. But it's still mostly coal, and most of the remainder is still other fossil fuels. So you may feel driving your electric car that you are not contributing to carbon emissions or environmental damage, but when that original electricity is made, you still are. And so, to some extent, what we are seeing is the movement of pollution from one part of China to another part of China where the coal is burned to make the electricity, from coastal China to interior China. And again, as I mentioned before, batteries don't grow on trees, and so when you make the batteries, you potentially create a pollution problem. And then when your batteries are done, because batteries don't live forever, you have to deal with the materials afterward. And that creates another potential big problem. Not that it can't be solved, but it's a genuine challenge. So those are big successes so far, why everyone is paying attention to China, but also why there's significant problems. Now, they're looking ahead. There are several wild cards that can affect what direction China goes in and potentially what direction the rest of the world goes in. The first wild card is what are Chinese policies going to be? In particular, what is the policies going to be towards subsidies? The Chinese have said they are gradually going to phase out their subsidies, and now that they just announced that they're applying the subsidies mostly towards longer range electric vehicles. But if they totally phase out subsidies, what is that going to mean for demand? Is demand going to dry up as you get rid of the subsidies? So will China do an about-face and re-raise the subsidies eventually? The dual credit system, a genuine experiment. How is that going to be implemented as tightly as they say, or are they going to be flexible? And then, will China go from hinting that they have an all-NEV goal to actually stating that they will? These are things which haven't been decided. Then we've got another wild card, which is the quality of new energy vehicles. Will they increase their range enough now? And what will the performance of the batteries be? Will they degrade over time? Will they be consistent? Will people start looking at NEVs beyond Tesla as cool cars that they would choose when they just come up with a list of cars that they might buy? Those are all real challenges and wild cards. Another, the mobility model. Ride-sharing has grown dramatically in the United States, in China, in India, and other places. And China is also developing autonomous vehicles. I visited Baidu's facility, and they have created a Apollo project that has many companies participating. And you can go around China and you can see cars like that collecting data. And in fact, actually, most of Baidu's data collection for autonomous vehicles is in Northern California and Pittsburgh and Arizona, because it's easier for them to get licenses to drive their cars around to collect data there, to develop the knowledge, the data that then will go into the platform. But in any case, they are working on this. And if China were to move towards a mobility model that included electric, autonomous vehicles where there was significant ride sharing, That might radically increase the market, because when you call up your Uber or your Lyft or your DD, you may not really care what hood ornament there is. You just want a nice, clean car. And so that might raise the possibilities for expanding that market. But will this market really work? Will it be as widespread and broad as some advertise? Finally, potential alternatives to pure electrics. You've got hydrogen fuel cells, you've got other types of biofuels, you have even improving the internal combustion engine and making it more efficient. And you have hybrids. You could roll, if you just switch the world to hybrids now, you wouldn't have to change just about anything about the global infrastructure for charging. Maybe a little bit. You could supplement the existing world, but it'd be really inexpensive to do, and you get a big bang for it. So these are potential challenges to the economics of NEVs. All right, let me close up with some recommendations before we move to the panel. So for me, there needs to be three primary goals in focusing on this sector. The first is that we need to support multiple transport energy solutions, not technology neutrality, but technology plurality, supporting lots of different alternatives. Because in my view, we haven't come to determine which one of these is necessarily going to be the best. I think we also need to ensure global access to raw materials that is sustainable for the materials and for the places where they are obtained, and for how they are treated after they're not needed any longer. And thirdly, we need to expand market access in China and in third markets. Specifically to achieve these things, I would encourage the U.S. government or local governments to provide funding for R&D support for new energy vehicles and other energy solutions, tax incentives for consumers and producers, and disincentives for high emissions vehicles. I think we ought to continue to promote sustainable autonomous vehicle networks and ride sharing, but at the same time protect the existing models of traditional ownership. I kind of like my car. It does a lot of things that rideshare will never do for me, because my car is not only my car, it's my closet. Sometimes it's my hotel. Sometimes it's my kid's bathroom. I have to admit that. But these are things which I'm not going to do in rideshare. And therefore, there's going to need to be multiple types of transportation solutions going forward. And then lastly, market access. That 25% tariff that China has is super high. It's a big disincentive to sell in China. The joint venture requirement that China has, China may think that this helps them with technology transfer and building their domestic sector, but it's not clear to me that that is worked out with internal combustion engines or whether it will work out with electric. And then battery certification. You need to make it so that the world's leading battery makers can sell batteries in China and compete with the Chinese in other markets. So that's my presentation, my overview, but that's just one point of view. Luckily, we have several experts with us today who I'll invite to come on stage, and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today. Let me first introduce our panelists. The first, right next to me, is Zach Kahn, who's Director of Government Relations for North America for BYD Heavy Industries. He's been at BYD for 3 years. Before that, he worked at Wave, which was a charging infrastructure company, and so he's been in this industry in different components of it for several years. Next to him is Anand Shah, who's a senior advisor with Albright Stonebridge Group, a strategic consulting company here in Washington. He previously led global strategy for new ventures at BMW on urban impact and autonomous mobility. And he also was an advisor and manager at Audi in the social innovation department. And before that, he was founder and CEO of his own company, Saravajal, a company that was focused on clean water solutions in India. And at the other end is Jonas Nam, who is an assistant professor of energy, resources, and environment at Johns Hopkins CIPS. He's an expert on green industries, innovation, and the energy sector overall. His current book project, which I can't wait to read, is entitled Varieties of Innovation, the Creation of Wind and Solar Industries in China, Germany, and the United States. He has a PhD from a school that focuses a little bit on technology that some people have heard of called MIT. So I think we've got a great group here. Unfortunately, John Stoll is under the weather, can't be with us at the public event, but he covers the global auto industry based in Detroit for the Journal, and we will integrate his ideas into our report, and we regret that he can't be with us this morning. So let me ask each of you an initial opening question to get things started. So let me start with you, Zach. So Warren Buffett was an early investor in BYD. Can you tell us a little bit about BYD's history, its vision, its key areas of focus now in China and elsewhere, including in the U.S., which is the market that North America, the market that you serve? And what makes you most excited about this sector? And are there any things that make you nervous or concerned about where the sector is going?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Thanks for the presentation. It was interesting. I'm probably a little more bullish on things than some of what you put out there, but we can talk through that later. So BYD actually right now is 220,000 people around the globe. We've got about 30 different sites where we manufacture vehicles and other sort of things, and we are really a global company at this point. But we started in 1995 in Shenzhen with about 20 people, $300,000 to be a battery component manufacturer for electronics, cell phones, tablets, computers. And that's, to this day, is actually still a huge part of our business. BYD Electronics, where we work with all the major manufacturers, including Samsung and others that everyone's probably used the BYD componentry today. So in 2000, we kind of had a big break when we worked with Motorola to be their first lithium-ion battery provider, and we did the Razr flip phone, which was quite popular in the early 2000s. People still remember that fondly. And then in 2003, we bought a Chinese domestic car company and started to get into transportation. So we still to this day do produce some fossil fuel-based cars from that initial car company. But in 2008, we developed, we started as a battery company, and that was sort of why we got into the car industry. So 2008, we launched the first dual mode electric car in China. And in 2010, I believe we started doing, that's when we did the Denza partnership, or the Daimler partnership, which ended up leading to the Denza car in 2014. But that's also when we started doing our E6 and our E5, which are our all-electric taxi products. We now have about 87,000 electric taxis all around the world, predominantly in China. Shenzhen alone has about 12,500 electric taxis, and they're looking to fully electrify their taxi fleet. 2010 was also when we entered into the bus market, so all electric buses. And in the U.S., and I'll talk about what we're doing in the U.S. more, but that's really what we launched first here, and what we're known for in the U.S. is our buses. So right now we've got about 40,000 electric buses, all electric buses on the road in the U.S., around the world. Most of those are in China, but they're really all around the world. We've got buses on every continent. We've got 200 buses on the road in the U.S. with another 300 plus on order, whereas in China, in Shenzhen alone, we've got close to 16,000 buses on the road. And I think one of the things you touched on is just the scale of how things are going in China as compared to the U.S. 15,000 buses in Shenzhen is the equivalent of all the buses in New York City Transit, New Jersey Transit, LA Metro, Chicago, and Toronto, the 5 biggest transit agencies in North America. Are all of their buses, diesel, hybrid, CNG, are less than the 16,000 electric buses in Shenzhen. And I was just there for a couple weeks, and literally every bus you see is electric. And the most unique thing about it is just how matter of fact it is. It's not anything major. It's just the way of life there, which is tremendous. And then the other thing is we entered into the all-electric truck market about 2015. We've got a few thousand trucks on the road, and this is everything Class 5, Class 6, Class 8 trucks, refuse trucks, sanitation trucks, drayage trucks, kind of anything with wheels we are in the process of electrifying. So it's really exciting. And then we've also developed businesses and other clean energy businesses, because our real focus is on essentially capturing energy through PV. We have a solar business, storing it in energy storage systems. We have a big energy storage practice both in China and in the US, and then using that for electrified transportation. And then last year we developed the SkyRail, which is one of the things we didn't touch on as much is with all this influx of new cars and new folks coming to cities in China, congestion has become a real issue. So we launched a monorail system as a solution for congestion in medium to large cities, or small, medium, and large cities in China. And it's international at this point, but in just the first year, we've got over 212 miles worth of monorail contracted for, and I've already put some out there in China. The Philippines has some projects coming, as well as Egypt, and we're working to develop some of those in the US. So that's big picture BYD. We touched on a little bit of everything. In the last 3 years, on the passenger vehicle side, we've sold more cars than any other. Each year, we've sold more cars than any other, more plug-in cars than any other electric OEM out there. And this year, we'll be building our 300,000th electric car. So there's a lot going on the electrified transportation space at BYD. In terms of what I'm excited about, I think the market is moving incredibly quickly. Not just in China, but in the US and in Europe, Latin America as well. In 2017, there was a period of 6 or 7 months where 13 different car manufacturers made big announcements committing billions of dollars of research and development into their electric vehicle program. Volvo committed to, by 2019, only doing plug-in vehicles, whether it's hybrid or electric. And you're seeing more and more of the cars moving in that direction, along with countries coming in and saying we want to get rid of countries, cities, states trying to do stuff to get rid of diesel, which is really moving things quickly. And then on the heavy duty side, I don't think folks realize just how far that industry's come along, but you've got Tesla getting into the game, but you also have Volvo electrifying their trucks and their buses, and you even have folks like Cummins, which is traditionally an engine manufacturer, announcing that they're going to be doing an electric drivetrain. So there's a big move in that direction. Mitsubishi Fuso and all the operators are starting to test them out. So I do think 2018 is going to be a year where on the truck side you'll see a lot of expansion to set up the real 1,000+ truck orders coming in 2019. I think from a concerns perspective, infrastructure is a big concern for me. Getting the charging infrastructure built out fast enough, along with working with utilities to come up with the right charging rates to support massive transportation electrification, not just from the rates, but also the demand charges and other concerns that can hurt the total cost of ownership model. I think there's a lot of, in the US where I'm a little more focused, California is doing a lot. All of their IOUs currently have proposals in front of the PUC in California to put about $1 billion worth of infrastructure investments in the next 5 years, which will just be a fraction of what's needed, but is a good start. And they also submitted proposals for how to deal with EV rates and whatnot. So I'm excited about that, but it is going to be a big challenge. And I think on the sort of what's happening, our focus in China, I think we're trying to answer a lot of the questions you raised. I think performance and style and the look and feel of our vehicles has been our big focus for the last 12 to 18 months. We brought on a former chief designer from Audi, Wolfgang Eggers, to really take the helm of our design on what we call our Dynasty series of cars. And they're looking a lot more cool and they're predominantly SUVs. The range is moving up and up. I noticed a lot of our new models that we'll be announcing this year will be 400-kilometer range and above. I don't think that's a coincidence given the new higher voucher amount. And so I think that's been our focus. And the last thing I just want to touch on is you talked about the batteries a lot. And BYD started as a battery manufacturer. We remain a battery manufacturer. And we've used an iron phosphate. To date, we've mostly used the iron phosphate technology, lithium iron phosphate technology, which is addresses a lot of the concerns raised in terms of the predominance. Lithium, iron, and phosphate are a lot more available, a lot fewer concerns with availability. They're also a lot better in the environment. They're fully recyclable. At the end of life, we're working with a lot of our transit agency partners where at the end of their bus life, we'll take the batteries off, put it into an energy storage system that then can be used for another 20 years of service as energy storage. And then when they're done, there's a recycling process that does not have some of the environmental concerns that you addressed. And I'll stop right there and look forward to questions.
Thank you so much. That's a super helpful overview because BYD has been such a leader in China and elsewhere, but also touches along a lot of the questions that I raised as well. Let me turn to Anand now. I want to ask you about where the auto sector is going overall. Maybe first talk about where Detroit's been and to what extent Detroit has been slower or actually faster than people have conclude with regard to new energy vehicles. And I've heard you and others talk about the mobility model. Interviewed a lot of people for this project to talk about that and involving ride sharing on autonomous vehicles. And how likely is mobility to revolutionize transportation, and where does China fit in that? Is China a potential cause of that revolution, or a place where maybe we're likely just to see it happen first?
So a lot of questions. So I'll try to cover all of that in one sort of conversation around the confluence of things that are happening right now. There's clearly a strong policy drive all over the world on getting vehicles to get off of fossil fuels, but there's also a conundrum, as Scott showed you in his presentation. China is heavily subsidizing electric vehicles, as is the United States. And it turns out that an electric vehicle in the US is not something a lot of people want. So if you look, a good statistic to look at is the price at which used electric vehicles are selling at. And they're selling for virtually nothing. You can buy a 2015 Nissan Leaf today on the wholesale market for $5,000. Hey, that's less than the battery itself is worth. And the reason residuals are low are complicated in the nature of human beings and how we choose to have a relationship with cars. So, many of us, when we buy a vehicle at a personal level, are irrational buyers. We don't buy a car necessarily unless our irrationality wants us to be a clean energy person. We don't buy it for the cost of ownership or the fact that I only drive 37 miles a day and range doesn't matter. We buy it for the one day that I might want to drive to Pittsburgh to see my mother. And even though I could rent a Ferrari, I need to have a car in my garage that actually will get me there. And the complexity of that exists around the world, largely because of the way in which the auto industry has evolved over the last 100 years. So one of the things that I learned when I entered the auto industry is that you can predict the demand of people and their relationship with cars for long into the future. And that's why the industry has evolved in a way where people can build 2 to 3 cycles ahead, which is they're designing a car for 2020 or for 2030 today, because they know that consistently year after year after year, as people get richer and move up the value chain, they will buy more cars. Right? And that's been a tried and true lesson. It's why Detroit or Munich or Stuttgart or Tokyo, the way that they've built these businesses are around this idea that I can keep building. There's cycles, and you've had 100 years of experience in it. That, I think, is about to change and is at the core of why Detroit is behind, why new companies that come from it outside the box, BYD being one of those and perhaps a pioneer in that, but why there's a Foxconn Tencent partnership trying to build a vehicle from scratch, why you can go to CES or the Detroit Auto Show and see, companies that we see up on the screen, whether it's NIO or it's Byton or whoever that are building vehicles from scratch with a new concept, or Tesla, which has been perhaps the pinnacle of rethinking the way that we look at cars. And let me explain why this is an issue and why mobility is potentially changing, right? In the United States, a personal vehicle, and we'll talk about commercial buses in a little bit, but a personal vehicle is used 3.8% of the time. Right? That means it sits for 23 of 24 hours a day. And in order for us to deal with those cars that sit for 23 to 20, of 24 hours a day, we have to have parking spaces on the road. We have malls in Texas that can hold thousands and thousands and thousands of cars. We have garages in our house. We have streets that have parking on the sides of them. It turns into property value of whether I get parking or not. There's all kinds of issues. In New York City and DC, 30% of public space is allocated to parking. Right? And it's not mobility as a service in terms of ride sharing or something else that matters, but it is the idea that digitization of mobility can change this fact. Right? So let me put this in two different ways that are kind of maybe make it more obvious. If you spend $50,000 on a car that you keep for 5 years, you're really spending $50,000 on something that you could have paid $4,000 for because you only use it 3.8% of the time. If I can deliver you $4,000 worth of mobility over the next 5 years that gets you everywhere you want to go and allows you to store your stuff in it and allows your child to use it at a restroom or whatever it is, gets you to your mom, right? Wouldn't that be better than having to own a vehicle and find parking and have insurance and get it repaired and go to the dealer and have to buy parts and wonder if I lost it or if I remember where to park it or any of those things? This wasn't possible yesterday. And that's how our markets evolve. And to think that people won't change like this, that's already happened in many other industries, right? Like, people used to live in suburbs in the 70s and they were used to having garages and sometimes stables and places where they could put things, and they've moved to cities and they've downsized and they got rid of stuff that they didn't need. Like, I think that people will change for things that they want that are better. And that's the one thing that rideshare has proven, right? It's not making money. It's not good business. Neither is electric vehicles, by the way, right? But ride sharing has shown that if you make it less frictional to get from one place to the other, people are willing to push a button rather than own their own car and have a garage and have to find their keys every day and remember to get it serviced every 9 months and get oil change and all these sort of things, right? And that is somewhat interesting. Another thing to think about from a perspective, if I were a city planner, I would drool over the opportunity to get back space. I can create new parks, I can create low-income housing, I could make congestion better, I could clean air, I can do a lot of things if you got rid of these pesky things called cars that have to sit around all the time. Right? That wasn't possible yesterday. And if I were just thinking about this from a grand perspective, every vehicle that's sitting on the road right now, including mine, that's just sitting there, right? Or every vehicle that's on the road that is empty, has one person in it but has four more seats, should be seen as wasted public space. We couldn't do anything about that before because we believed that people needed to own vehicles. If I have a Suburban that has 9 seats in it and I'm still alone in it, that's a right I have. Right? If I have a Toyota IQ that has 2 seats in it, and 1 seat's empty, that's also a right I have. This is changing, and it can change, and it's significant. Now, the third component to this that I think, in the digitization story that's part of this confluence, in addition to security and imports of oil and all these sorts of things, is that one of the things you couldn't do before was move a car, right? So if I do park it outside, can I send it back home? Not without a driver. In China, you can do it in India because drivers are cheaper than machines, but that's a different story. Here, I can't send the car back, right? That's why autonomy is coming about. Right? Now, suddenly, if I have a robot that can move the vehicle, it enables possibilities of other things. And it is the single greatest mass market use of artificial intelligence that anybody can dream of. That's why everybody's spending billions of dollars trying to build a car that can drive itself. Why? Because this market of automotive around the world is a $10 trillion market that sits around 96.2% of the time. Right? It's a lot of money to unlock. It can reduce the cost of getting from one place to the other. It can change property value. Turns out in DC, the most expensive property value is near a metro station. So the people who don't need to take the metro are the only ones that can afford to live next to the metro. Right? If I live further out where I'm poor, I need a car to be able to get somewhere. These things can change when we change this metric of how vehicles move around. So I call this the space race of the 21st century. I want to explain why. What was the space race in the 60s? It was a race to show which nation was advanced, which nation could think about the future, where young people and talent were willing to go, because this is a place where if I bet my life and my career, that I'm going to move the furthest. I think today, the biggest thing that is in the horizon is how we rework cities' transportation and mobility. People care about congestion, they care about air quality, they care about where they spend their money. We care about national security issues on whether or not we're importing oil, we're importing coal, whether we're creating energy from clean sources or not. And all of these things at some level could be connected to or interconnected with transportation and mobility. Make no mistake, China is leading in a piece of this. They're selling more electric vehicles. They're making a lot of noise on artificial intelligence as being the frontier. They haven't yet set a date for full electrification, but they're also producing more and more power. The statistic on coal being 70% of power 10 years ago is now 60% of power. That's a pretty big move in 10 years, right? For plants that take 10 years to build, right? So they're doing things. Japan says if you go there in 2020 for the Olympics, you'll move around in a robo-taxi, right? America is allowing autonomous cars on the road faster than anybody else. Korea is doing that in different places. In my view, the thing that I look around and says, what's a really hard problem to solve, like getting a man on the moon that no one knows how to do, is a robotic car that can change the way that air is cleaned and how much energy they use and all these sorts of things. These things are all happening all at once, and they're a confluence. It gives city folks what they want. It gives a country what they want strategically. It gives consumers an opportunity to go clean, have better transport, spend less money. It gets space to be better and less congestion, potentially gets us low-income housing. These are big deals. All of that happening at once in an industry that's not ready to figure out that consumers are willing to change. And that's why Detroit and other places haven't yet wrapped their head around this, but they're trying. So I'll end there.
That's super helpful and persuasive about the logic for why this is a potential direction that we're going to go in, and maybe we're further ahead than most of us realize. Washington oftentimes is behind the curve on at least a few things. Jonas, let me turn to you now and ask about the energy side of this equation. NEVs promise huge benefits in terms of lower fossil fuel consumption and reduction of carbon emissions. And China's obviously placing a huge bet on pure electric vehicles and doing so over hybrids and other fuel energy options. I've heard some express a concern that focusing on pure electrics and commercializing them may shut off or limit the commercial possibilities for other potentially even better energy solutions. What's your thought about this, not just China, but since you've worked on this question globally, how does this problem look and where does China fit into that?
I should preface this by saying that I was in the political science department at MIT. Across the street, there were people like Anand. We all had innovation envy because you could go to the media lab and learn about the future of the world, and then we would come back and study Washington, which is not sort of the most innovative thing to do. But let me give this a crack anyway. So China has excluded fuel cells from their sort of deployment targets, and they've mostly pushed electric vehicles, but I think they have not excluded plug-ins, for instance. So it's not maybe quite as drastic as you make it sound in terms of technological choice. But I don't think China really ever had a big fuel cell program, and Germany and Japan have worked on this much longer. So I don't think China sort of felt like that this was particularly suited to what they could bring to the table. On the other hand, they had a big electronics industry that was already there. Batteries were an attractive thing. So there were sort of, overlapping interests, I think, in pushing for these things. In terms of lock-in, I think that's a real possibility. I do a lot of work on the solar industry. We've all gone through this recently with this sort of rapid cost decline in the solar sector as a result of kind of incremental manufacturing innovation in China and the lock-in essentially in solar technologies that have been around for a long time but that have gotten progressively better and cheaper, and stuff that maybe 20 years ago we thought was going to be the future and potentially and theoretically should get us more efficiency in the future has no chance in the marketplace just because the conventional technologies have become so cheap. And I think that is a possibility in the electric vehicle space as well. I think there's a few reasons for why China would push electric vehicles, though, and not really consider that sort of danger in a way. For one, part of, as you mentioned, the reason why China's pushing EVs is because it's not ever gotten successful at having an independent domestic traditional auto sector. I mean, they've tried this since the 90s, really since the 80s. And I've never really gotten independent from joint ventures. And I think the short story is that China's been terrible at making combustion engines. And so, you have thousands of moving parts. These are complex things, and they've never really taken off in China in quite a sort of successful way. Meanwhile, I think an electric engine has 14 moving parts, lasts 10 times longer, is much simpler. So there is a sort of chance to leapfrog here in a way that allows domestic firms in China to finally become independent from foreign partners, which is a big kind of central government goal in China. And so I think that might also explain the tendency to go full electric and not have plug-ins, because then you sort of just get rid of that entire technology field altogether. So that's, I think, one reason why they are willing to kind of put all their money in that basket. I think a second reason is that China actually is a very fragmented system. So the central government sets these broad targets, but a lot of the impetus and the motivation needs to come from local governments. If you give too many conflicting targets or too many technological options, local governments aren't going to do anything. And so I think you need to sort of give a clear direction, because there's limited fiscal resources at the local level. And so the less confusion, the better. I think that local governments think, if the signals are right, we're going to invest in infrastructure for charging, we're going to do all of this stuff, but they don't have the incentives at the local level to be supportive of technologies that might work out in 15 years. So fuel cells, I don't think, are sort of a hot commodity for local officials that are evaluated every 3 years on their performance, and everything relates to GDP. And so there's sort of real constraints on what types of innovation that they can invest in sort of within that political system. So I think these are some of the reasons why kind of an all-out EV strategy might be there. And so what that does is China's investing very heavily in battery production capacity. I think the kind of projections show by 2020 China will have 65% of global lithium-ion battery production. And I was just at a very excellent workshop organized by David Hart, where a lot of people were complaining in the storage space, not for electric vehicles, but in the grid storage space, that essentially all they can buy in the market now is car batteries. So we've basically jointly made a decision that we invest all our R&D money in car batteries, regardless of whether we're trying to do storage for a wind turbine or other applications. And so there are sort of lock-in effects that maybe are less critical in the electric vehicle space right now, but might spill over to other sectors, because we're sort of making a big bet on a particular technology. But I think there are also good things from that lock-in. And so maybe a few sort of random reasons here. One is that China, through the dual credit system and through sort of these requirements domestically, is really putting heat under the foreign manufacturers to come along. I'm German. The Volkswagen emission scandal was not a great source of national pride. And Volkswagen did not really show any kind of enthusiasm to really change things until China came along and said, well, you're basically out of the market, and we're selling 70% of our cars in China. And so there's innovation happening now among actors that weren't particularly interested, and whose governments weren't particularly interested elsewhere in the world. Last year, I toured a Volkswagen plant in the south of China. They were working with KUKA, the robot manufacturer, on trying to figure out how to make production lines that could build combustion engine and electric vehicles on the same line. So you could sort of flexibly mix how many cars you make of each type. And we toured along this, and they built the whole car in an hour while we were in a little golf cart, and someone got in at the end and drove it off. And so that made me sort of think this, Volkswagen hasn't been particularly on board with any of this stuff, but China is now getting them on board. And so if we're locked in, but this is what happens, that's maybe not such a terrible idea. And you mentioned Detroit and maybe Munich as well, and Berlin. We've had sort of wavering support for these technologies in other parts of the world. The Germans have basically been in cahoots with the car industry and have done nothing. They've had all these EV goals and then had exactly zero incentives for people to buy them, which means that I think the goal was 1 million cars by 2020, and I think they have 14,000 in 2018. So clearly there wasn't anything coming from the Germans. I think the US had a very good, almost like an industrial policy strategy under Obama. It was coming from many different parts of the central government administration. But there was a lot of policy momentum there, and it's kind of dying down under Trump. And the car industry has been very quick to now argue for relaxed emission standards and all this sort of stuff. So if China can sort of carry the flag there and say, we're going to keep pushing, even if it is a lock-in kind of question, that may not be such a bad thing, because I don't see where these alternative technologies would come from. Japan's been working on this for a long time, but it's not like we're sort of seeing a concerted effort to really establish an alternative elsewhere. And so if this is sort of a suboptimal outcome, I think it might be a pretty good outcome nonetheless.
That's super helpful. So I think what you're saying is, even in the lab that were across the street from the building you were in at MIT, even if the labs show that there might be better things to pure electrics, if actually in terms of policy and actual market existence, if the choice really is pure electrics or internal combustion engines mostly, what China is doing is still a big improvement and may actually pull others along and make others step up to the plate, which then would be may affect actually what happens in Europe and the US as well. So terrific. Okay, I've got tons of questions. I'm going to hold off on all of my other good questions, because we've got a lot of smart people here who also have good ideas and questions. And so I want to recognize folks from the audience now. Please, when I call on you, identify yourself, your name, and the organization that you're with, and keep your comment brief and to a question if at all possible. So I'm going to start right here. And there's a microphone coming because we are also online, and we want to make sure everyone here and in Asia and everywhere else can hear you.
Dan Liebman. I'm a writer. I'm not sure if I heard you correctly, but I thought you said that on the assembly line in China, the car was made in 1 hour. And if so, if it's all robotic, how do you price a car like that? How do you know what to charge for a car where there is very little actual human value in it?
So I'm not an industry sort of technical expert. I think that most cars are made this quickly. I mean, this sort of fully automated assembly. I think the innovation there was that they could do different models on the same line. So it wasn't sort of the Model T where it's one car model, but that you could do an Audi and then a Volkswagen and then an electric version, and it could all roll off of the same robots. And I think they price them just like they price their other vehicles.
Yeah, I think we were talking about other, not just about cars, but others, things that can be made much more quickly. You were talking about the monorail system, and what's the speed for that you've seen for that in China?
So our first commercial monorail system was in the Yichun province, which we built from, I think it was 134 days from contract signing to delivery of 4 miles of track and 7 trains for their flower festival. So that is unheard of anywhere, in particular the US, but we were able to get it done in China.
Wow. I'm going to take you out to Dulles Airport after this, but we're not.
Might take us 134 days.
Yes, I'll get you to a station, and then we can hitch a ride or call up Uber to get the rest of the way. Okay, over here. Yes, sir. In the third.
Ken Austin, U.S. Treasury Department. Just one technical question about the original presentation. Orally, you said that there was something like 320 billion in subsidies and expenditures. The slide said that was in renminbi. Could I just ask for clarification?
Sure. So I meant Chinese dollars. So 320 billion renminbi out of 900 and some odd billion renminbi in car sales, so still 35%. Yes. So which is, yes, so divide by 6 point something to get the US dollar figure. Yeah. Yes.
Which is not that much.
Michael Copley, reporter with S&P Global. On battery sustainability, what sort of pressure are companies in China under to address environmental, humanitarian issues around raw material extraction and supply chain issues? Thanks.
Not being based in China, I can talk to that a little bit. So I mean, I think, like I said, we focus on iron phosphate to begin with. We also have agreements with all of our suppliers in terms of where they, I don't know the technical term, but they provide us with certification in terms of the sustainability, environmental, human rights aspects of their operations. But I can't talk intelligently too much on that, unfortunately.
I can jump in a little bit. So not so much on the extraction side, but on the recycling side, there are requirements that car companies need to take these batteries back when they die, essentially. And so in interviews with Chinese EV manufacturers, that was one of the biggest concerns, because they're now selling a ton, and they know they have 7 to 9 years until all of this stuff is coming back to their lot. And there isn't really an industry yet to sort of service that demand, but it's a government policy that they will have to figure it out.
And I'll just add, I know that there is also a, not just BYD, but Volkswagen and BMW are really pushing to own actual lithium mines and other raw materials, so they actually produce it, or they are locking in their supply now for what they see as their demand for the next 10 to 20 years.
All right, next. Yeah, right here in front.
Zachary, you had mentioned about trying to find, I guess, the sweet spot in the charging rates. And I was wondering, how expensive is it to charge now? Is it an appreciable cost or not?
It's very dependent on what your utility is. Every utility is different. So, in the numbers we've done, and I've been particularly focused on the medium and heavy duty side, and it's about a third the cost of traditional, diesel or CNG to go electric. So it's anywhere, I'd say about 15, 20 cents a mile, potentially, if I do the math right. And it depends. When you add in demand charges, that could bump up your total costs. But if you add a lot of vehicles, your demand charges might go down. And there's also charging management systems that we employ, so you minimize how much load you're pulling off at any one time. But if you think about it, just the grid generally, as more and more solar comes on, and there ends up being excess solar in some areas, particularly in California, for example, the duck curve, you can use that time as a time where the utilities can incentivize charging because they've got the excess capacity. Similarly, in the middle of the night, when wind turbines are blowing pretty furiously, but there's not a lot of demand, particularly with fleet vehicles, that's a great time to charge. And if you're seeing more utilities trying to figure out how they can incentivize that for fleets, and it's going to make a big difference, especially when right now transit agencies in the U.S. have been really good at getting 1 to 10 bus demos going, but when they start looking at 200 to 500 bus deployments, the infrastructure requirements and some of those costs become a lot more difficult for them to deal with, to wrap their heads around.
And there's both to add a little bit to that, there's both a positive and negative. There's an opportunity and a bunch of issues in this, because one big fundamental thing that needs to get resolved is the interaction between batteries and the grid when they get to large numbers. And there's a lot of opportunity there. There may be business models by which batteries solve problems for grid providers and utilities and discoms, and Jonas may be able to speak to this more. There may be ways to disconnect the battery from the vehicle so that utilization rate of the battery goes up more than a vehicle does. But I do think it's an important question that we have to answer as EVs become more dominant.
Particularly on the heavy duty side, the other thing in sort of a post-Sandy, where every city has a chief resiliency officer, these, particularly on the heavy duty side, these are going to be looked at as roving power plants in emergency situations where they could go vehicle to grid, vehicle to load, charging a Red Cross tent, or even getting a gas station up and running so people can pump their gas, which would be ironic, but it's certainly a possibility of what you can see coming in the future. If New Jersey Transit had 1,000 electric buses, they could have deployed those in ways that could have helped in Sandy.
Yeah. I can just mention one twist on this, which doesn't get directly to the cost, but is a different type of model. There's a company called NIO, N-I-O, which is Chinese-based, primarily investors from China's internet industry, Tencent and others, but also has Western investors, has employees from many different folks, including originally from BMW and others. And their model, they just came out with some SUVs they showed off in Detroit and CES in Las Vegas, is battery swapping. That is, you get on your phone, you push a button, and someone comes and takes your car away, and within an hour, that's the promise. Whether it's the reality is not, but they bring back a fully charged vehicle. There's not been, as far as I know, a successful business model of battery swapping where someone comes and takes your car away, but nevertheless, they're going to try it first in Shanghai. It means you have to take the car out because to do this charging that fast, and you've got to have enough batteries. You've got to have most likely high voltage charging so you can do it quickly, which is something that you don't want right outside your home or something because it's potentially dangerous. But they're going to try it. And if it is successful, then maybe, if they could get to the scale, then maybe others will adopt it. And I don't know, and that may end up affecting the price.
I think in Israel you can still see some Better Place battery swapping stations that they had.
Mm-hmm. And there's been success in Taiwan around Gogoro and the battery swappable scooters. Mm-hmm. So they have, you can pull it out of a wall with your hand and replace it in 20 seconds.
Okay.
I would add to the cost question, though, too, this idea that, you mentioned this in your presentation as one of the challenges is the sort of continued reliance on coal, but in part, the sort of push to renewables is really symbiotic with electric vehicles, and I think that's why the California utilities are so on board, because they have these mandates and they need to figure out how to do it. But China has a notoriously terrible way of managing the grid, where basically every province can decide how much power can transfer across borders to the next province. So what that means is in the Northeast, where you have a lot of wind, you can't get rid of the power because no one wants to buy it, because provincial officials want to buy power from their own power plant because that helps their GDP, and then that helps their review at the end of the year. And so, I think there is a possibility here for EVs to become sort of a way of breaking that apart and creating economic incentives locally to actually use power more smartly and not completely mess with this performance system that is so hard, so ingrained that I think it's really difficult to reform.
Sure.
So cost plus benefit.
Yes. Other questions? In the back here.
Hi, Amy Jordan, based in Aramco. I guess following up on your last comment, are there any possibilities for smart charging infrastructure in China that you're seeing any sort of pilots for, or any move to utilize the renewable energy like the wind or solar so that you can take advantage of charging at peak solar times or peak wind? Thanks.
Do you have data on that? I'm in the middle of collecting these numbers.
Yeah, I don't have I know that they're experiments. But not widespread. I mean, that's the basic conclusion that I would come up with right now.
And I know we've set up a bunch of parking stations for charging, 200 to 500 electric buses that do have solar power. You're never going to have enough solar power to charge that many buses. There's just, you would need acres upon acres upon acres. But it's helpful, particularly if you're going to use it for storage, to kind of avoid some of the peak charging.
I think we have time at least for one, maybe two questions. This woman right here in the third row.
Hi, Susanna Stevens, U.S.-China Commission. To what extent does this supply chain that you've described build on the existing supply chain for automotives? To what extent are those two supply chains completely different and not related at all? And then a follow-up question, how does this change the upstream markets?
I think that, Jonas alluded to this. The electronics supply chain that China has actually feeds really interestingly with some adaptation into the automotive chain in an electric vehicle, right? And so if you put a couple of pieces together, China's investments in upstream and full stack sort of battery manufacturing, which is 50% of the cost of a vehicle today, maybe a little bit lower or higher here or there, but that's a big deal, right? Plus you have all the solid state electronics capability that China builds for the rest of the world. There is certainly engineering, software capabilities that are still potentially missing, but one could make an argument that China is really well placed to build the kind of product that an automotive is becoming, which is perhaps as complex in number of parts as many other electronic things that we buy from China. In terms of further upstream, from what I can tell, and I'm not studying this, but like Detroit, that market's still trying to figure out what to do with this. There's a lack of belief that this is actually happening at one point, and as car numbers continue to grow around the world, it doesn't really seem like doomsday is around the corner for auto components, and so people kind of ignore it. On the flip side, as the part line simplifies from 3,500 parts or whatever it is for an internal combustion engine to 20 for an electric vehicle, I would expect there to be a bit of a bloodbath.
I think we have one more question. The gentleman in the back. Yes.
James saying, there's some use now of a capacitive charged buses in urban environments. Is there any way of integrating both the battery and capacitive charging systems, or are they always going to be completely orthogonal?
I think I've seen situations where the capacitors used as sort of a range extender, but I'm not sure. I know fuel cells I've seen where they've been used as a range extender to allow, basically to be the charger for the batteries on a battery electric bus. And you're seeing more projects on that. One point on fuel cells, which I meant to bring up earlier, is I know that China hasn't been doing it that much on the light duty side, but I was on a panel with someone on Beijing government, and he had mentioned kind of offhand that we're just getting into fuel cell buses. We're not really sure about it. We only have 2,000 of them on the road. And I was with the executive director from the Air Resources Board in California, and he was just blown away that 2,000 buses just dipping their toes in the water, because that would be a huge improvement of where we are in the U.S. on fuel cell buses. Wow. It's a little off topic from your question.
And there are examples of supercapacitors married to batteries. There's a startup that just started, but the issue with supercapacitors and capacitors in general is that you don't get as much range, but you do get infinite rechargeability, which you don't get with battery cycles. And so, there are people experimenting with fast charge every 3 miles or so, where the bus has a battery. A battery is a range extender to the capacitive capability, but every stop that the bus makes, it charges a capacitor. That is happening, but it's very, very early.
Well, we've just about reached the end. Hopefully you found a lot of new information and new ideas. I think the earliest 20th century saw the birth of the vehicle, and it fundamentally transformed our lives and our economies across the planet. It's possible that the move to mobility will bring the same kind, but we know that at least with electric, which is already starting to be commercialized on a very wide scale in China and potentially other places, that will bring major changes to the industry and perhaps economies as a whole. We'll need to see if some of the things with mobility start spreading much more quickly, but nevertheless, I think what at least I can conclude is that China is in the very heart of this contest for different technologies and is not on the outside looking in. It's a direct participant. And so even though a lot of folks in Washington, including myself, are focused on the government support numbers and things like that, it's not a straightforward call on whether we ought to be encouraging or discouraging these things. There's a lot of different issues at play at the same time, which is the conversation that we want to get started with this series. So lastly, and so please be on the lookout for our report next month on this topic, where we will integrate a lot of the views that we've heard today and the comments that you all offered as well. Lastly, please join me in thanking our panelists who were extremely helpful today.